Welcome to Soul Sparks with Saima. Today's episode brings us into the deeply human world of a healing with Whitney Walker, a licensed marriage and family therapist, recovery coach, and spiritual guide whose work blends clinical expertise with soulful insight. From addiction and trauma to sovereignty and self trust, Whitney has helped countless people reclaim the parts of themselves hidden beneath generational patterns. In this conversation, we'll explore what it truly means to interrupt inherited wounds, rewrite emotional legacies, and step into a life aligned with authenticity rather than survival. So, Whitney, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Oh, you're warmly welcome. It's my honor to have you here. So, Whitney, you work closely with people carrying the weight of generational trauma. So, can you share that what's the earliest sign that someone is leaving out patterns that didn't originate with them?
Well, I think that when we talk about generational trauma, it doesn't necessarily mean something that we experience. It means something that's occurring in our family. So some issues you might see with your parents, they might be avoidance. They might have not ever addressed their own trauma, things that happened to them. And so then they create unhealthy, ineffective coping mechanisms. And so then you see this happening. You see this happening in your family of origins. It might be in the relationship between your mom and dad. It might be in their parenting styles where they have ineffective ways of trying to help you or parent you because they never learned their own tools. So generational trauma refers to something that's you can see, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be affected by it. When people begin to break free from generational trauma, it just means that they learn how to have different coping skills and how to self-regulate and operate in a way that's not exhibiting traits and tendencies that their parents had due to the trauma that was passed down through their generations.
So thank you for sharing that, Whitney. And the way you explained it really highlights how deeply these patterns can show up in someone's everyday life, without them ever realizing where they come from. And it's really powerful to understand that what feels like a personal struggle might actually be much older story that they're carrying. Now, building on that, do people usually recognize it themselves, or does that awareness only come through deeper work?
I think that it takes opening yourself to the idea of healing to be able to see what's going on. Otherwise, it can just seem commonplace. So, a lot of people will not recognize something as an effect of generational trauma because it's just seems normal to them. It might be how their parents act, how their family acts, how extended family acts when they all get together. So they can't really identify it as something that's problematic if it just seems natural, right? Like a fish in water, a fish isn't aware of the water around it. Well, if you grew up and are surrounded by people living within their trauma, having traumatic responses to things, you don't know. So it takes opening that door, which again is why it's considered breaking generational trauma, is you sort of have this aha moment where you say, wait a minute, I don't think that this is how things need to be. I think this is unhealthy. I think this is dangerous and damaging to myself and other members of our family when they're in denial, when they're persistently acting in a certain way that's hurtful, harmful to others in our family. There's this clear pattern you start seeing, but it takes somebody you have to be aware of healing, of therapy, of changing cognitive behavioral stuff, recognizing that things can be different. If you don't realize that, then there's no way to change it, right? It's always identify and then heal. You have to identify that there's a problem. And again, if you that's why that's why generational trauma continues because most people just say this is how it is, right? When there's a lot of fighting, when there's abuse, let's just talk about that. Abuse can be seen as commonplace in certain families, that it's normal to criticize and berate people, that it's normal to be so overbearing and controlling of your children that you don't let them make their own choices. This can all seem normal if that's is what you've grown up in. It takes awareness of that individual to say, this is affecting me negatively. And I don't ever want to put this onto my children, should I have them, bring them into my family when I have one. And so you decide, well, maybe there a new way is possible. And it starts with me.
Mhm. That's really meaningful way to put it, Whitney. And just being open to the possibility that healing is needed can be a huge step in itself. And I really like how you describe the process of recognizing what isn't ours to carry and then choosing to release it, like you explained. And that takes, I would say, both courage and compassion for yourself. Now, something related that I'd love to explore with you. Like you talk about codependency as an inherited pattern. So why do you believe like so many families pass down this dynamic without realizing it?
Well, because again, like I said, it just feels commonplace. It feels normal, right? So let's identify codependency as using something outside of yourself to feel regulated in your emotions, to be able to make your own decisions. You can't do it on your own. You've decided that you do not have inherent dependence on yourself. I can make my own decisions. I can be alone. I can do this by myself. I don't have to worry about what that person thinks or feels or is saying, not in a neglectful way, not in a hurtful way, but just I can feel regulated and safe without anybody else. Codependence is when you start to be dependent on somebody or something else outside of you with something that you're meant to be able to provide yourself, right? Like again, peace of mind, a sense of safety, emotional regulation. That should not be anybody else's responsibility other than yours. Yet, for a long time, especially for women, I focus my work with women. Women have been told for a long time that they cannot function without a man, that they need a man. You need a provider, you need a partner. You have to have that in order to make it in life, right? So, by nature, that's kind of telling us that you are not self sufficient. You are not able to feel independent. You need to be dependent on somebody else. And even if we look at the word dependent, what that actually only means is when you think of someone who's a child, right? Well, a child is literally dependent on their parents for financial support because they don't have a job, right? So that's a normal way of being dependent on somebody. What's abnormal is when you're dependent on somebody, when you're a grown adult and you have choices now. You have a choice to make your own way. But if you decide, no, I don't know how to do that, that's not safe, then that's when it becomes codependent. Your well being is tied into somebody else, which is a dangerous place to be. When we speak of it in therapy terms, it mostly has to do with emotions. So it feels like you can't do anything or make any decisions or feel at ease without somebody else's response or their approval. So, yes, codependency has been going on for a long time because we have been told for hundreds of years that people need a partner. You can't make it in this life alone. You need to seek approval. That's also a big part of codependency. You need someone else to sign off on what you're doing, what you're saying, what you think, what you believe. There's a lot of people where codependency comes through as not being able to make their own choices around preference or beliefs, right? If you ask someone who's very deeply ingrained in a religious sector, they might feel like they have to align with those ideas. And I'm not criticizing anybody that's religious, but it's just a literal fact that if you feel that you need that your church's idea about something before you can make your own mind up, that's codependency. Same goes within a family. If you feel like you cannot make your own choice about something without checking in with your partner, in terms of just not even knowing your own preference, that's codependency.
That is really a powerful point, Whitney. And the way you explain that how society, especially through the lens of women's experience, reinforces this idea of dependency really highlights that how deeply these messages get, woven into identity and family patterns. It isn't just behavior, I would say, it becomes a belief system that, passed down through generations. And hearing you speak to that with such clarity really helps us understand the emotional and cultural roots of codependency in a much more compassionate way. So now I'd love to take this deeper with you because you work at such an interesting intersection as both a therapist and a spiritual guide. So how do you help someone distinguish between their learned survival strategies and their authentic self?
Okay.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, you have to, like I said, it starts with identification. So use everyday experiences as your guide. If you're trying to choose whether or not you want to take a certain job and you've just sit with it and you've been offered this job and you feel like, I don't know how to make this choice by myself. I feel stressed. I feel anxious. I feel anxiety is going to be your greatest indication that you don't feel comfortable with something presented, right? So if you're feeling that, like, so what is our authentic self? Our authentic self is ideally our essence expressed, right? But most people, that's hard to find because it's so covered up. Like, think of your authentic self as this beautiful glowing light within you. But over the years of codependency and messaging and trauma, it's like a window that gets all dirty. You know, when a window has a bunch of layers of dust and dirt on it, you can't see through it, right? So when we're looking for our authentic self, we're essentially going through the layers of washing, clearing off that window so that it can be shown. So how do we clear up those layers? You have to look at, well, what are those layers? Are you having trouble making decisions because you've always been told what to do? Do you not trust your own judgment? That's a huge component of codependency. You have learned not to trust yourself. Your authentic self, trust yourself number one. When you are aligned with your authentic self, you will look to nobody else except for yourself because you know that you're your own greatest source of wisdom, understanding, and guidance. Who else could it come from? Anybody else's input is just that input. And I'm not saying, of course, we all have those times where we get a job offer and we're like, okay, I want to call my best friend, I want to tell my partner, but we don't rely on them to make our choice. We want to hear their insights, we want to hear their ideas, but at the end of the day, we're going to make a choice based on our authentic self. So, and that's just one example, but just look at any time where you feel stopped in your tracks in your life because you feel like you can't make the next step on your own. And for people who are very codependent, this comes down to not knowing what to have for lunch. Some people, and again, it goes back generations. The further you go back, my parents, right? They didn't make those choices alone. Everything was done with a partner. So you put somebody like that by themselves for a day and they're not going to always know what to do with themselves, right? That's severe codependency. Women nowadays are breaking free from that in droves. We're really moving towards greater independence. We're moving towards, and more importantly, more internal freedom, not feeling beholden to what other people have told us about ourselves. That's another key point. When we are codependent, it's because we've started to believe what other people have told us about ourselves. So again, walk through your day and you go into a work meeting and you think, I'm not going to speak up because I've been told that I'm not that smart and I don't have very good ideas. So I'm not going to say anything. I'm afraid. What is that based in? That's based in what other people have told you about yourself. Who is anybody else to tell you who you are and what you're capable of? Only you can know that. So as you go through every day, look at where you're holding yourself back. Look at where you feel scared, stiff, because you don't know if it's safe to do something. Somebody who is fully in their authenticity feels almost no fear ever because you know that even a quote unquote misstep, okay, I did this and it didn't work out, is a learning opportunity. There's nothing to be afraid of. That's the other problem with codependency. It is rooted in fear. The fear, again, that you can't trust yourself, the fear that you might make the wrong mistake and that would be bad. All of these negative repercussions we worry about. So we stay codependent, holding on to dear life to other people's ideas and thoughts because we're so afraid of stepping into our own power and truth.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I really appreciate the way you framed that, Whitney, especially the idea that anxiety can actually be a sign we're staying in what's familiar rather than what's true for us, like you said. And it's such a compassionate reframe because instead of seeing anxiety as a flaw, you are helping people recognize it as a message, a signal that there's a deeper part of them asking to be acknowledged, and the encouragement to trust themselves. That's such a powerful invitation to step into who they really are. Now, I'm curious about the turning point in that journey. Like, what's the moment when people finally, trust that their authentic self is safe to emerge?
Well, it's when you're able to take that step without checking in with somebody, without having to have somebody else's sign off or approval of what you're choosing to do, right? So, for example, you and I both have podcasts, and we decide to create a podcast because we believe in discussions, conversations around topics and ideas that we consider important, right? That's a risk because what if other people don't like it? When you put yourself out there, when you put out your own creative intellectual ideas, you're taking a risk. When you feel ready to take a risk without anybody else's sign off, it means you're stepping closer to your authentic self. And even something smaller, if you're able to self regulate, right? Let's say that you're at home, you have a family, somebody calls and they say, "Hey, we found out that, your car is in the shop and it needs all these repairs and you're going to have to," and we just get super anxious and we're like, "I need to call my partner. I need to figure this out. I can't do this on my own." When you learn to say, "Okay, I'm gonna come over to the shop right now and talk to somebody," when you learn to start taking autonomy back, "Okay, I am capable of doing this." And again, I'm not saying that, like, if you don't know anything about cars, you might want someone's opinion, but, like, some people won't do anything on their own. Anything. They'll get that call and be like, "I need to call my husband. I need to call my husband." I'm a therapist, right? I have so many clients who come to see me because 'cause they're at that point. They say, "Everything I do, I feel like I need to check in with my partner, and I wanna start feeling comfortable and safe and making decisions for myself." So when you're able to do that and take risks, like I said, starting a podcast, telling your story, writing a book, doing things on your own that may seem a bit out of line with what your family might say, with what other people have told you is right, wrong, good, bad, safe, whatever, that means that you're gaining some freedom. Because you also have to realize that codependency is involved in every single addiction that exists. It's the heartbeat of addiction, codependency. Because just as you described earlier, anxiety is our friend. It's telling us when something is challenging us, when something doesn't feel right. It's our intuition going out into our body and our nervous system saying like, "Hey, something's up. This is making me uncomfortable. Why?" Yet the problem is that most people, rather than sitting with their anxiety, they will do whatever will take that god awful feeling away because anxiety feels terrible. So the problem is that most people want a quick fix. That's the nature of addiction. Going to get someone else's approval is a form of addiction. It's a codependent addiction where you're sitting there so uncomfortable because you're waiting for your partner to call you back and tell you what to do. Do you understand? It's like and it's the same thing when they feel anxious and they go for a drink. They're like, "I can't sit with this. I don't know what to do with this. I'm so uncomfortable. Oh God, there's a drink. Now it's better." Not to say everybody who takes a drink to relax is an addict, but that's where addiction begins. Then that's the nature of codependency. You use something outside of yourself to create internally what you're meant to do yourself. We're meant to be able to sit with anxiety and resolve anxiety without a drink, without approval, without somebody else's intervention. When we decide that that's not possible, that's where codependency/addiction comes in. I'm not capable of self regulating. I can't stand this addiction. I'm going to get somebody else to make me feel better. I'm going to get a drink to feel better. Do you understand?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes. And I really like the way you said that. That moment when someone creates or shares something purely because it feels true to them and not waiting for approval, like you said, not needing permission. And it's such a beautiful expression of freedom. And the courage to do that, like even in small ways, I feel really shows that authentic self is finally getting room to breathe. And the way you describe it makes that transformation feel both empowering and very human with me. So, for people who are just starting to recognize this deeper patterns like generational trauma can feel enormous, like something too old or too heavy to shift. So what's one practice that that can help them or help someone begin interrupting that legacy today?
Yeah. So let's look at the example. Let's say, because we're talking about generational trauma. So it's a pattern that's been passed down from generation to generation within your family line. So let's say you had a mom who was completely codependent with your father. They were just a stay-at-home mom, not just a stay-at-home mom. That's a noble profession, but someone who was just the homemaker was always looking to their husband to make choices, to have finances, to get approval. The father was the ruler of the home. He made all the decisions, and the mother just did whatever. And you just saw this people pleasing, right? You just saw your mom never wanting to upset your dad, never wanting to say anything that might rock the boat because he was the one that ruled the roost and the home and made the decisions. And you see this and you're like, wow, I don't like that. But then you notice that you start doing it, right? That's where we have to look at where generational trauma does kind of creep in, right? I said earlier that generational trauma doesn't necessarily need to be something that you are afflicted with, but you may start to notice it. You may have tendencies where you're like, why am I starting to be so overly giving and attentive to men when they don't deserve it? Why is that my go-to? Well, it's because you saw it for years with the dynamic between your mom and dad, right? So you can the first step, like I said, is always identify. Identify. So let's use dating as an example. If you start to feel like, man, all my dating experiences are a disaster. Inevitably, I get involved with somebody and I give way too much of myself. I just want to pour myself into them, my love, my affection, my nurturing. And they always end up treating me like shit. They treat me terribly. They minimize my needs. They give the least amount of effort. Then they start being very critical of me. And it's awful. And you start to wonder, well, why is this happening? And it's because you don't know your own worth and value because you never saw your parent do that, right? You saw your mom act as if she had no value. It all came from your father, right? So you say, I want to go do something about this. Maybe you go see a therapist. Maybe you read some books on it. Maybe you start journaling about it. You look at where the root of where this is coming from. You identify the problem. I feel like I'm incapable of being involved with a man without totally losing myself. I might, and this is common for women, you might feel totally confident in your work environment, but in your dating life, you feel like you can't understand it. That's generational trauma. That's where it's been passed down along the lines. And you're saying, well, wait a minute. I deserve a partner who is respectful, who I feel an equal with, who I feel safe with, and who I feel loved and honored by, just the way that I want to do for them. So it is hard to take that first step, but it's also exciting and empowering when you realize that nobody can stop you from breaking generational trauma. And it doesn't take anything except for you. Yeah, you might want to do therapy, read a book, but you can also just sit down and journal and consider it and think about what would I like to see? If I'd like to see a healthy relationship, well, how can I start towards that? And one of the biggest keys I'll also note is that everything depends on you being kind and gracious with yourself. I'm not a proponent of punishment for growth. We need to treat ourselves so gently because we didn't choose this. It's because we saw it. That was our environment. That's what we were messaged for years. When we break generational trauma, we do it with kindness and love, not with force and anger.
That was so beautifully expressed, Whitney. And I really like the way you highlighted both sides of that first step, like how intimidating it can feel, but also how deeply empowering it becomes once someone, realizes they can make a different choice that was handed to them. And the reminder, like I said, to be gentle with yourself through that process, that's such an important piece. I would say you're giving people permission to to go at a human pace, to honor the fear and still move toward healing. And it's a really compassionate way to help someone imagine themselves breaking a cycle that felt unbreakable. So as we close, let this conversation remind us that generational trauma is not a destiny, it's a pattern waiting for someone brave enough to transform it. And every moment of awareness, every boundary, every act of self trust becomes a new legacy. So your healing is not just for you, it ripples forward and backward through your story. So begin with one conscious step and watch the entire lineage shift.